Ready to start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. I'm going to be walking up and down so you can see the rest of the panel. I'm Deepak Patel, Head of Climate Finance at the Presidential Climate Commission, and we are very privileged and honored to have quite a lineup of panelists for this morning. It is the first session at COP27 in the South African Pavilion. So friends and colleagues, welcome. We have on the panel Daniel Mminele, who probably by now requires very little introduction. He has the unenviable task of leading the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team. And as you know, a lot has developed, particularly in the last week or two, around South Africa's jet investment plan. Next to him is Lebogang Mulaisi, also a PCC commissioner, but more importantly, head of policy at the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And as we know, there will be no transition unless it's a just transition. Next to her is Mr. John Merton, who is the United Kingdom's Climate 27 envoy, as well as has the unenviable task of coordinating amongst what we call the International Partners Group, that group of nations and jurisdictions that kindly a year ago made the offer of $8.5 billion towards South Africa's just energy transition. Next to him, we have, in the guise of a newcomer organization, Simon Harford, who is the CEO of the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, a multi-party global philanthropy that has not only taken an interest in South Africa's transition, but has been a friend and has provided great assistance in some of the early work that we needed to do. Next to him is Nazmeera Mullah, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at 91, an asset manager of global standing, but certainly on the African continent, a very important player as it relates to private sector investments, not only in a generalized portfolio, but in fact, hopefully, towards making the transition to sustainable, green, and just transition investments in South Africa and on the continent. Next to her, we have Yasir Ahmadi, who comes from the Institute for Economic Justice, but very importantly is a mandated youth representative at COP27, accompanying the PCC delegation. Next to her, we have Amar Bhattacharya, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, but also a seasoned development finance executive and practitioner, formerly advisor to the president of the World Bank. As we kick off this morning, unfortunately, some rules. We have, as you can see, a rather large panel. I'm going to be quite autocratic in the way in which I manage time. I won't manage content. And to kick us off, I would like, if it is at all possible, to call on Daniel to talk to us about the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, the journey to date, the very interesting way in which it has evolved and was launched by the president last week for consultation, but as the president said, very, very importantly, for getting a move on with the implementation of those aspects of it that require very little debate. Daniel, you have 3 to 5 minutes to frame the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Deepak. Good morning, everyone. Let me first add my own welcome to that of Deepak and our co-host for this function this morning. I must tell you, those of you that do not know Deepak, if he says he's going to be very autocratic this morning, that will be entirely out of character. That is very much unlike him. He'll struggle to do that. Thank you so much for making time to be with us this morning. As you know, we have reached a significant milestone in terms of our JETP process and in terms of a just energy transition process with the release of the investment plan back home in South Africa on Friday, and with us then handing it over to our international partners a couple of days ago, a significant milestone based on the tall order and the real immense task that was given to us post COP 26. And I think this is a real achievement given the complexity of the task, given the time that was available to put that plan together. I do think, at the risk of talking one's own book, that we have actually put something on the table that is quite impressive as a plan and very detailed, touches on the key aspects of it. I would say that what are sort of key foundational issues around the plan is that it is a plan that looks to address multiple objectives, while of course at the centerpiece of it, it's about us delivering to our decarbonization commitments as contained in our national determined contribution. But the approach that was adopted was one of saying we need to look at this also from a point of view of a whole economy transition, a whole society transition, and have that woven into other objectives, key objectives in South Africa that would basically help a general economic transformation to inform our growth and development model going forward. So in a sense, as we seek to decarbonize the economy, we are also making sure that we deliver on the objectives of addressing key structural challenges around inequality and poverty and unemployment in South Africa, and have these all interact in a manner that helps us achieve broader objectives with them. So the plan in itself is structured as whilst it does give, of course, effect to the Just Energy Transition Partnership from Glasgow, it goes a little bit wider in its framing, in that it does not speak only to the $8.5 billion that our partners committed to mobilize, but it sets out the scale of need for the first 5 years in relation to the 3 priority areas of the electricity sector, new energy vehicles, and green hydrogen, into which then the commitments from the JETP in terms of the $8.5 billion over 3 to 5 years that contributes on the strength of the quality of the investment plan. So it's a detailed plan that goes into various aspects of how we would prioritize the investments, how we would sequence them, and allocates and prices the various components of the plan in a fairly detailed way. The scale of need amounts to about 1.5 trillion rand over the period, and that also includes from the 3 priority sector of cross-cutting investments that have to do with national skills development and capacity building. And the key feature of it is the central tenet of a just energy transition, to make sure that, given the high level of dependency of South Africa on fossil fuels and a concentration of that in a particular region of Mpumalanga, that as we transition to a greener future, we leave no one behind. We, in the short term, make sure that appropriate safety nets for workers and communities that are affected, but in the longer run, secure their livelihoods through economic diversification and the development of new energy sectors as such. So the next steps, because I think I'm probably coming up to my time, in terms of the plan, what we will be doing now that it's available and it's out there, it will allow us to progress some of the financing discussions in terms of the package that needs to be finalized, elements of which I must say are already in play. We've got parts of the plan that will register fairly quickly in the sense that, for example, 2 policy-based loans from KfW and AFD that are part of this package have already been executed and will likely flow early next year. But the big push post-COP, the law, is for us to develop a comprehensive implementation plan that will speak to monitoring and evaluation, develop a matrix to make sure that we can track progress, to make sure that we put in the right governance and accountability structures. And that's something that we want to do without delay, and during the first quarter of next year, have that finalized so that we can then get to the real hard work, which is then the implementation of the plan.
Thank you for that overview of what the JET IP is and the processes that we've undertaken to get here. I want to turn to Lebogang Molaisi now, both as a PCC commissioner, but also as the head of the policy unit at COSATU. We talk about the just transition. What are your bottom lines? What is your perspective on the JET IP? And do you have any words for us about how to ensure that we do not pay lip service, but in fact have a fundamentally embedded just transition approach?
Yeah, thanks, Deepak. Thank you, Deepak, and thank you for the opportunity for the trade unions, particularly to weigh in on this topic. So you can understand a lot of anxiety around people who work and people who depend on industries that have relied quite predominantly on fossil fuels and particularly the coal value chain. So every time we do our engagements with workers, I mean, just the sheer anxiety in the room when you speak to somebody about the potential of a job displacement, I think that's where we need to premise our conversations from, not from theoretical understanding of what concepts could look like and what they sound like, but what it actually means in terms of bread and butter needs for the ordinary person that has relied on these sectors for generations. It's not just them. This goes back, you know, from their grandparents, and their grandparents. And that's where we need to premise the conversation, and understanding that as and when we plan for financing, how do we address those real and legitimate concerns? I always make the example that if somebody told me now that, oh, well, your job doesn't exist in the next 5 years, how would that make me feel? I think when we approach the subject in terms of how these concepts make the ordinary person feel in a country that has the worst inequality in the world, in a country that has very high levels of unemployment and rising poverty, that's when we begin, especially the policymakers in the room and the people who make the decisions, that's the premise in which we must then begin to craft our investment plans, our financing decisions, our conditions on who gets the finance. My real concern, I think, is that we stand a real risk of replicating the economy that is not efficient currently and calling it a just transition and not venturing deep enough into the substance of what we mean as a just transition. This is a country post-1994 that didn't institute restorative justice. We have an opportunity to do this with the just transition. And I think these are the bottom lines that we need to consider when we do our financing. So when we push the Daniel Minelas of the world to say, go deeper in terms of how we structure this economy, go deeper in terms of how we conceptualize financing in the context of a just transition, we're saying go deeper because we have real deep needs that we need to account for. And it's not just workers. I really want to echo this. It's not just workers, it's people who ply their trade in the informal economy. It's not just big industry that we must make plans for. We must think of the person at the bottom of the value chain that's not necessarily contributing to high productivity gains. And these are the things that we need to start conceptualizing for and inputting this into South Africa's just transition energy plan, because to an extent, these are the things that actually matter at the end of the day. I'm not going to belabor the point. I think 3 minutes is already up.
Thank you for those framing words, Lebogang. I'm going to turn to the end of the panel now, to Amar. Amar, you've had a lifelong practice in finance, development finance, various types of finance that can be made fit for purpose. But more recently, I heard you espouse the notion that a climate response strategy and plan is not separate from, indeed unified with, the developmental agenda. Could you share with us your perspectives on how you see South Africa's transition unfolding, but more importantly, what role South Africa's JET IP as well as the Just Transition Framework plays in the rest of the world as well?
Thank you, Deepak. So I want to just pick up on what the last speaker said, that this has to be an inclusive growth opportunity. And, you know, we have to, in some sense, tackle particularly the insecurity of unemployment and create new employment. So without fundamental change, we won't achieve that. And the climate agenda, therefore, has to be linked very centrally to the development agenda. I think the investment plan that has been put forward, and I'm an outsider and academic, so I can say that with some independence, is precisely the kind of model that is needed to lay out an actionable plan. And it's not just only about finance. If you read the plan, it's about investment as the driver. It is got justice running through it in a recognition. All the details are not there. And indeed, it's important to press for the details, but it's also important not to wait to implement. That would be my first point. We have to get on with it because ultimately it is about, in some sense, getting a transition that delivers both on climate and development goals. Second, I think you need accountability. You need accountability mechanisms within the country. And if you read the investment plan, it puts forward those accountability mechanisms. But let me also be blunt and say we need accountability mechanisms on the international community. It's really good that John's here, and it's good that we have a program. But I want to emphasize something. This is not a one-year shot. This is a sustained effort, 5 years to start with, but it will require a shift, a generational shift. And the international community has to be there in the kind of journey with accountability and delivery. I do have some thoughts about what kind of finance do we think this investment plan will need. I can wait for that if you want.
Thank you for those framing words, Amar. I'm going to turn to John Merton now. John, as the coordinator of the International Partners Group and being present from the time that the political declaration was made about a year ago, you have managed, together with the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team on the one hand as your counterparty, and a pretty challenging group of jurisdictions to manage on the. Can you share with us, number one, whether you found this journey to be useful? How do you see this? Is this the beginning, or is this the end of the international community's participation in South Africa's just energy transition?
Thanks, Deepak. So just to pick up where Amar left off, I mean, it's absolutely just the beginning. That's clear. It's written into the political declaration. This is a multi-decade partnership aimed at securing a lasting, sustainable, inclusive transition of South Africa's energy economy. So the political declaration was the very beginning. The investment plan is another step forward, but as has been identified, we will need a more granular plan going forward. That's the aim of the implementation plan that Daniel and the team will be working on. So it's very much the beginning. One of the questions that I've had a number of times is, to what extent, what will the $8.5 billion be spent on? Is it real? Is it new? And the answer to that question is yes, it's absolutely real. And because it's new, sometimes it's difficult to define what it will be spent on. If we have existing projects that we throw a JET-P blanket on, I can tell you exactly what it will be spent on, but it's not new money. If we have new money, which is what the JET-P is bringing in very large part, then of course we can't necessarily at this stage define what the money will be spent on. And that's the role of the investment plan and the implementation plan going forward. But what's clear is that the discussions that we've had between the IPG and the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team have been really helpful in identifying where should that money go? Where should the grant components go? Where should the very concessional finance go? Where should the sort of the less concessional finance, but still concessional money go? And where should the private equity investment that's reflected from things like British Investment International and the Development Finance Corporation go in order to crowd in private sector money? And it's been really helpful. We've been led by our South African colleagues and steered by their guidance as to where's the best places for it to go. And as part of that discussion, we've been able to talk about energy sector policy and the evolution that's required in energy sector policy, because you could use concessional finance to support the development of a solar farm or a wind farm, but that would be a waste of that concessional finance, because we know that all around the world, solar farms, wind farms can be financed completely privately if the enabling environment is there. So a lot of the discussion is about how do we create the enabling environment. In the UK, we've pulled in over $100 billion of private sector finance into our offshore wind sector over the last decade, because we've created the right enabling environment. And the hope is therefore that we can work together to ensure that the private sector money comes in to those areas where it's required, and that the concessional and the grant components can be used to address those areas that the private sector will find hard to grapple with, the sort of thing that Libo's been talking about in terms of just transition for mining communities. One final point, if I may, which is absolutely this has to be a just transition, but the single biggest thing holding the South African economy back is lack of power. And load shedding, really, I mean, all the statistics are out there that it has a very dampening effect on GDP. Because if you're a small investor, a small entrepreneur, and your power goes, you've either got to buy a generator or you've got to pay your staff to do nothing whilst the power's off. So the key component, the key objective of this plan is to enable the South African population everywhere to have access to cheap, clean, affordable power that will drive the economy forward. And that will create jobs and employment and actually enlarge the sum of the South African economy so that everyone can benefit from it.
Thank you, John. I'm going to turn to Nazmeera now as a natural segue. 8.5 billion, given what is now emerging as the quantity that is required for South Africa's full transition, not just the just energy transition, is going to require huge mobilization. And within this framework, we all know that it's going to be largely the private sector in the form of savings, the private sector in the form of commercial lending, the private sector in the form of private equity. Nazmeera, what do you see as the savings potential to tap in South Africa as we undertake this transition? But more importantly, is the private sector, asset managers, the life companies going to come on board for this transition?
Thanks, Deepak. I think the South African savings sector is very eager to participate. Execution ability differs between different players, but I think there's a real desire to participate in infrastructure financing for two reasons. One is what John and Daniel have started to allude to, which is the major growth constraint over the last decade has been infrastructure-led. It has been power, but increasingly is ports and railways and infrastructure constraints. So when we talk about jobs and just transition, part of it is how do we take care of affected workers, but also how do we create the new? South Africa hasn't created jobs for 10 years. The other element is it's a really attractive risk return. Infrastructure offers a very compelling risk return profile on both the equity and the debt side. And we've seen that internationally. In South Africa, we saw that with the first 3.5 rounds of the renewables. So currently, if we look at the life insurance sector and we look at the asset managers, there are some players who can take the debt in the form it currently exists. 91 is one of those parties. So in addition to the banks, you will see the savings pools, the asset owners, eager to participate. But I think part of the challenge is going to be once you get a pipeline of investments coming through. See, Deepak, I'm being optimistic. We're going to get enough projects through the pipeline that beyond the take up by the current players, we'll also need to get it into a form that the big balanced funds can take. And that's where I think we're going to have to be a bit more innovative. Because if you're a balanced fund manager in South Africa, which are the biggest pools of savings, and given the recent loosening in the exchange control restrictions, you have domestically focused balanced funds who are looking for diversification. This could be a fantastic asset class for them, but it will need to be listed and it will need to be a local investment grade. So how do we get it there? So two-step process. Step one, get the projects going. They can be financed. There is a desire. Step two is we need to be able to transform this into pooled vehicles that can be accessed more broadly.
And to Simon now. Simon, as global philanthropy, but I would imagine also the emerging domestic philanthropic sector. You have no doubt been watching these developments with great interest. Since the various COPs, we've moved from an only environmental set of considerations to a full socioeconomic development approach to the transition. Do you see the role of global philanthropy as being additive, as being supportive, or do you see yourself also being quite venturesome as you look at the role of philanthropic capital in all of these transitions in South Africa, but also around the world?
Deepak, thank you. We absolutely see philanthropy as fundamental to supporting all transitions. We're not just watching, we're actively involved already in South Africa and in over a dozen other countries, which is one of the things we can try and help with is join the dots and draw comparisons and learnings from different countries. We think, and to Amar's point about accountability, we think philanthropy must be accountable to support. And we've got a unique role to play to complement all the other participants. And I'm pleased to see Salim here from our partners, African Climate Foundation. It's not just the Global Energy Alliance and the philanthropy that backs us, it's all philanthropy. There's not enough philanthropic capital going into this crisis. And we need to grow the capital coming from philanthropy and target it very specifically to support what others are doing. I'm going to say a couple of other things and also amplify what my colleagues have said. First of all, we're a tough bunch on ourselves, focused always on what's not yet working. I want to pause and commend South Africa for what is going well. And again, we work across the globe as GIAP, and I really want to pay tribute to not just the leadership from the president about how important this is, what he has instigated with the finance task team and Daniel's work, and on his side, John's work. This is new, and South Africa's having to figure some of this out for first principles. Other countries can observe and learn from that. So it's always hardest when you're innovating. So on the finance side, on both sides, IPG and finance task team, there's been some excellent progress the last year. Then on the PCC, the Climate Commission, we think that is sort of unique around the world. And as Crispian knows, we are ambassadors globally for the PCC because we think it's such an important model. And to what Lebo said, I could not agree more that delivering the phrase just transition is very easy to say. It's really hard to deliver. And one's got to go deep, deep into the issues in each country to make that happen. And the PCC with its big tent approach, its consensus building, its dialogue, we've actually been recommending it to all other countries where we operate in whatever version works for them. And so in terms of moving forward, let me throw up a sort of few points about where we see not just GIAP, but ACF, other philanthropy, standing up and being involved in a complementary way. And it's all to echo this point about implementation and where do we go from here. Number one is we can take a long-term view as philanthropy, and this is a long-term issue, as others have said. This is a decades-long transformation of the entire economy and society, not just the energy sector. Number two, philanthropy can help with the institutionalization and the capacity in government to do this. And the current government is working with the legacy it's inherited. And one of the areas that we are already funding and moving very fast as philanthropy is to assist the government with the capacity it needs to play its role and to deliver on its accountability. And that lends itself well to philanthropic swift support. Number three is to continue to promote the PCC. The PCC itself is a young institution. How do we institutionalize and endure the PCC? And one of the specific areas we're working with is on the jobs and communities part. The devil's in the detail there. It must be done at a subnational, provincial, municipal, community level. Where are the new jobs? How do we create a whole new set of pathways in a clean energy economy for jobs, for which then the reskilling can happen and the small business transformations can happen from one value chain to another value chain. And then lastly, to the private sector and the renewables industry, to echo what John said, we think South Africa actually is one of the trailblazers in the world at already having attracted private sector capital into its renewables industry, both domestically and internationally. So its ability to accelerate and grow that should be easier than some other countries. It is all down to the enablers, exactly as John said. So again, philanthropy can help the DMRE, the IPP office, the capacity, the next wave of renewable rounds to unleash more capital. The model is already there in South Africa, more so than some other countries.
Hello. Thank you, Simon. Salim here, in his usual mischievous fashion, said, "Where are the youth in the PCC?" That leads me to the last framing contribution at the beginning of this panel. Yaseera is one of a number of youth delegates that are accompanying the PCC at COP27. They were chosen from a coalition type of process, and there are 3 of them, I think, or 4, who are accompanying us to various sessions and making their voices heard. Yaseera, I left you to the last knowing that you will be the loudest and the most demanding of this austere and august panel, which hopefully is going to create the framework and lay the foundation to pass the baton on to your generation. What do you expect of the just transition, and in particular, the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan?
Thank you, Deepak. I think when we're talking about the just transition, it's obviously we're all here because this is a non-negotiable aspect of our lives and our future. We needed to ensure that we don't have ecological collapse, but that we also don't have societal collapse. In South Africa, it's particularly difficult because of our codependence and because the range of inequalities and unemployment, the range of like social economic issues that we have that surround the background of our situation. When we talk about youth expectations of the just energy transition, to me, it's no different to the future of South Africa, because youth are the future of South Africa. So when we talk about our expectations, we are talking about what will the inheritors of the future get? What will we have? Will we have a good future, or will we have something that is a lock-in of fossil fuels or a burden of debt? And I think with this JET IP, it's great. I think that the youth are happy to see that we have a line item, that there's money dedicated to youth, especially in a coal-dependent area, that we are looking to develop the skills of young people, and we are looking at youth as a specific sector that we are dedicated to. The main problem that we have, and that we continue to ask for, Crispian knows, is for the power to be in the spaces where decision making is happening, and for the power for someone to be on this panel on ChatP, the Chat IP, and to have a say in how the money is being spent and where it's being directed. So from the position of the youth, we are asking for beyond the investment in infrastructure, beyond the investment in the technicalities, which is important, to dedicate financing towards the justice element. So more financing dedicated to skills development, job creation, economic diversification, because these things do not come naturally. Just because we're creating economic growth, this does not necessarily mean that jobs, that skills development will come along with it. So we are asking for intentional pathways towards this. Thank you.
So I'm going to turn, there's some delay as I put this mic on. I hope it's not affecting the audience. Daniel, we have the investment plan. The president launched it, for want of a better word, into the domestic environment last Friday. There are a couple of key questions now. While there might be debates about what is the road to 2050 and us finding a much more nuanced and certain way to undertake that journey, the early stages of the investment plan, I think, lay the basis for absolute consensus as we begin to implement. The key word being implement. What are the challenges that you see existing in the South African ecosystem to implementation, and what do you think the next steps are to prepare for sound implementation?
Well, thanks, Deepak, and I think there's an exceedingly important issue that you raised there, and I don't think we'd be revealing any secrets by saying that that particular aspect of implementation has presented challenges for us in various areas. We tend to be very well-versed when it comes to diagnostics. We articulate our problem statements very well. We devise plans that stack up. But when it comes to implementation, we sometimes don't always get it right. So there's got to be a relentless focus on implementation, and some elements, of course, of the plan within the first 5 years, as you know, with regard to the largest piece of allocation in terms of investment being the electricity sector as such, that needs us to move fairly quickly because there are short-term challenges around the security of supply, needing to strengthen the grid and need to ramp up at scale renewable energy. So some of those funds must flow there. So it's going to be very, very important that without delay, we get into putting in place the institutional mechanisms, the issues that I briefly touched on earlier around how we allocate responsibility, how we hold the respective implementers to account, how we monitor, how we evaluate, how we design structures that are sufficiently flexible for us to be very clear about what outcomes we are looking for. And if those don't register, that we are sufficiently flexible and agile to course correct very quickly. Of course, it's going to require continued strong political will and political leadership as part of that implementation process, and the kind of processes that we've already started in terms of making sure that the consultative and the participatory nature of the process continues. And we will need to move very fast to progress some of the financing components that were contingent, if you wish, upon the investment plan being delivered. So we need to get to those quickly that still need better articulation. But in many respects, as I said, great milestone to have produced the plan, but it's literally the end of the beginning, and the real work starts now. And the underlying challenge, of course, that we're addressing, both in respect of climate change risks that we need to manage, but also with regard to the structural challenges that I talked about earlier are urgent, are getting more precarious by the day. So there really is no time to waste in terms of putting in place very, very strong implementation frameworks and getting on with it. Pretty much what Amar said. We can't wait. Yes, there are always elements that could be better, could be more refined, but we need to work with what we've got while not neglecting those other issues that still need further development.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to turn to Lebogang now. Lebogang, you talked about the need to ensure that workers and their livelihoods, their families are taken into account as we undertake this transition. We know that the most impact, as well as the most rapid impact, is going to be felt in Mpumalanga. What are your perspectives about the fundamental things that need to be kept in mind as we give meaningful content to procedural justice, as we give meaningful content to the restorative justice, as well as the distributive justice issues in the context of what practically we know is going to happen in Mpumalanga?
Yeah, thanks, Deepak. And, you know, the conversations around Mpumalanga and how we talk about workers, again, we don't talk about them like they're human beings. We talk about, it's just these things, for lack of a better word, that you can take from one part of the region and move to the next, as though it's such a simple procedure, like there's perfect mobility of labor. So I think what's important for this conversation is how do we diversify the economy of Mpumalanga? The fact that they are in a coal lock-in currently, and all their economic activities and contributions to their GDP is solely reliant on coal currently. We need to address that very quickly. The biggest thing that we get when we go to the Mpumalanga region is this idea that there's so much potential for the region itself. Don't look at the region as something that has no benefit outside of the coal industry. There's so much that can be done, which is why I'm very optimistic, Daniel, in terms of the JP investment plan, in terms of mine rehabilitation as a serious intervention. This is going to be critical for the Mpumalanga region. Some of the studies that we've done is that agriculture is probably, due to the nature of agriculture and how labor intensive it is going to be some of the pathways in which we can ensure a just transition, a meaningful just transition in that particular region that doesn't see workers displaced and that doesn't see labor having to move across regions trying to benefit from other economic activities. So this is how we do the work to unlock and diversify this particular region. We don't desert it as some sort of ghost town and we move on as we try to transition, but we look for activities that can take place in that region that are labor intensive, that can absorb this job, which takes me to another thing. Now we know how problematic the agricultural sector is in South Africa in terms of how it just does not take into consideration proper labor standards. So these are the things that we also have to address while we're also addressing the issue of how the agricultural sector can now absorb all of these jobs. Because if we're not going to guarantee workers a decent job, expect that a mine worker is going to resist the change, because why should I leave my job that pays me a proper salary, that gives me proper standards of labor for a sector that I know is very precarious in nature? So we need to address the questions around precarity in that particular sector, because now we've identified it through mine rehabilitation as a potential absorber of the new jobs. These are the things that we need to do in the process of justice. We're not just moving workers from one sector to another. We're not just moving sectors from one region to another. We need to do this conscious of the fact that we are working with a decent work agenda. We are working around the issue of decent wages and decent labor standards, because without these, we can't achieve a just transition. So it's more complex. I think we also need to understand that the concept is complex in its nature, but we do have the institutions. I think that's another benefit about South Africa. We do have the institutions to bring all of this together. It just takes the critical thinking and it takes the time to listen to the people that are going to be affected. I think as policymakers, we do the work of running with what we think is the appropriate solution without listening to the people who are going to be affected. Take these into consideration so that indeed, particularly for the sense of workers in Mpumalanga, we do usher in a just transition.
Amar has already indicated that he has to leave a little early, so I'm going to turn to him now and ask him to consider two issues or questions. You raised the issue of the developed world having to come to the party more committedly, greater quanta, but you also have been raising the issue about doing things as we learn, as well as undertaking this very deep, sustained, multi-decadal, systemic journey, keeping an eye on the transformations that are required. What, in your opinion, should the developed world be looking to do? How do you think they should ramp up the available finance? And secondly, within the South African domestic as well as the global financial landscape, what are the critical things that we need to transform as we begin to implement?
Thank you, Deepak. So the reason I have to leave is we are launching with COP27 a paper that I've been involved, a report I've been involved with, Nick Stern, Vera Songwe, and a group of experts on climate finance. And I'm going to make some observations based on that. So, and basically what we are arguing, not just for South Africa, but indeed for developing countries at this point in time, is the necessity of a big investment push that can deliver on climate, that can deliver on development, and that can deliver on inclusive growth. This is the time, but it will require an exceptional response in terms of finance. And I want to apply some of our general insights to the specific case of South Africa. So at the heart of this investment is the transformation of energy, and particularly to clean energy. And this renewable energy, if you look at the numbers of the investment plan, are the largest. They can be a source not of cleaning up the environment, but of jobs, of good, decent jobs. But it will require proactive approach, and it will require finance. And let me say a very important point here. The cost of capital in South Africa is 3 times that of the United Kingdom, 3 times. So unless you tackle the issues of cost of capital, those investments will not produce the benefits we would like. So we have solutions on that, but I'm just ticking off the areas. Second, we will need a massive expansion of infrastructure, not just to support the energy transition, but to support growth. As Nazeeram pointed out, you need to tackle aging infrastructure in South Africa. The transport system needs to be revamped. That requires long-term, low-cost capital. What is the best source of such capital? Development finance institutions. Look at the numbers in South Africa. The development finance contribution is insignificant. We need a major ramp up of development finance in South Africa, with the international institutions really stepping up behind the investment plan, not each doing their own thing. Third, the acceleration of the phase out of coal will entail real costs because there's an asset, it's earning a revenue. You take it off stream, it will entail a cost. I don't think the Treasury or Eskom can take that cost. We will need debt-free finance for that. We are thinking about voluntary carbon markets as one possibility. Scale of it is not enough, but we have to think about the solution if we want to accelerate the phase out of coal. Fourth, we have to be able to take care of the affected people, and places, as was pointed out. That will require concessional finance, and the scale of concessional finance on the table right now is not commensurate with what is needed. And finally, we have to diversify the economy, as was pointed out, to create jobs in the service sector, in the industrial sector, and in agriculture. That again will require finance. I don't believe it should necessarily have to be highly concessional finance, but it will need predictable finance. So the challenges of finance are at the center of delivering on this investment plan and its ambitions. And at the moment, I think we have taken a good step with the first year, but we need a clarity on that roadmap. And I hope that, following the investment plan, we will develop a roadmap around finance with the international community stepping up side by side with what South Africa is doing.
Thank you very much for that, Amar. And I will excuse you as soon as you have to leave. Nazmeera, this means that we have to find solutions that are public and private. We have to find an environment in which we have virtuous cycles of learning as well as transformation as we move along. What do you see as some of the critical issues in the financial ecosystem in South Africa that need to be resolved as we attempt to harmonize, align, and therefore allocate capital in a coherent way, not necessarily in a centrally determined way? We have to find the partnership that will align behind a plan for what the future looks like.
Deepak, I think there is a massive willingness in the South African financial sector to try and find a plan. And if we look at the big banks in SA, they have struggled to grow their loan book significantly because of the relatively poor growth rates in the country. So they are completely aligned behind this desire to find a solution. That's the good news is, normally in South Africa, it's the private sector and the public sector having competing aims. Here, I think that aim is very much aligned. And I think the solution in the starting point is the same issues that will unblock the projects will unblock the finance. If we can get a pipeline of renewable projects going out of the mining sector, out of the private sector, and out of the relevant public sector space, the learnings from that will be immensely powerful. Let me give you a practical example. The REAP rounds were financed with 100% government guarantees. That's clearly not practical in terms of what we need to build out in the future. The government doesn't have that capacity on its balance sheet. But what we've seen in the last decade is globally, financial institutions have become much more comfortable financing with a corporate offtake. And that's where much of the pipeline that is going to come in South Africa is going to be financed, corporate offtake agreements. Where the banks now need to get to, which I recently asked Standard Bank at a conference they hosted, at what point do they get brave enough to finance with only a 50% offtake and the rest an intention to sell once it's built? Because given the shortage of electricity, that should be a no-brainer. Just you need to drag banks' credit committees down that road because they still would like ideally all the protection. So corporate offtake plus government guarantee. I mean, banks will take as much protection as you give them, but we need to move this increasingly to the point of what's the minimum required. And I think a huge flow of projects is the best way to do that. That's what we've seen internationally.
Thank you very much for that, Nazmeera. And I'm glad you raised that issue because commercial banks in particular sometimes believe that it's government that needs to create the enabling framework. Whereas in fact, I'm going to pick on some people in the audience as well at some point to ask them, what are they doing to transform the way in which they look at risk? What are they doing to ensure that they come to the party with their balance sheets and not stand behind depositors' money as an excuse? John, I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to ask you whether these types of capital that are composed in the $8.5 billion, and we coined a phrase together, I think, are catalytic enough, are concessional enough, and are coherent enough to play a meaningful role in the early stages of the just energy transition? And how do you think, besides this type of partnership with the international community, this can actually assist in mobilizing and scaling up the pools of capital that are available around the world and in the domestic environment in South Africa?
Thanks, Deepak. And you mentioned the 3 C's, and it's worth repeating them actually, because they kind of got some take up and people can remember them. and any good Church of England preacher usually has 3 points beginning with the same letter, and they are, in our case, that they are concessional. The money that we're offering through the IPG has to be cheaper than you can obtain on markets, otherwise there's no point, we should all go home. Secondly, they've got to be catalytic. The money that we bring has got to essentially enable a lot more money to come to the party, and they have to be coherent. We have to be working to a common plan, with the British not competing against the French, not competing against the Germans and the Americans, and so on. I've added a fourth C actually recently, which is country-led, which is important. And I think we've really seen that with the development of the investment plan. But those are important. That, you know, it's glib at one level, we have points of the same letter, but it actually is hugely important. Because it speaks to what we're trying to achieve. And we need to think through how we progress them. So one of the things that was in the discussion earlier on through the process was, should we be coherent to the extent of developing a single purpose vehicle, essentially, with one harmonized level of concessionality that we could all feed into? And we examined that, but actually, the changes that would be required in our own legal frameworks in the UK and France and elsewhere to deliver that would take so long that it wouldn't match the scale of the challenge in South Africa. So we've worked to try and balance those factors as we go forward. But I think the important one is catalytic. And I think we've had a lot of comments, and you yourself sort of highlighted the cost of capital is much higher in South Africa than, say, the UK. And that's hugely important for the renewable energy revolution, because with renewable energy, all of the cost is your cost of capital. Essentially, you put all the capital investment up front, and then the marginal cost of operating a solar plant is next to nothing. With coal, it's the reverse. You perhaps need less investment up front, but you're going to be dependent on buying inputs every year, and discount rates are hugely important. But the cost of capital and risk become really interrelated. Because, as you said, you know, what can the private sector do to de-risk? But equally, what can government do? Because if government can take measures that de-risk investments, then that will lower the cost of capital, and that's an important service that government can offer. The nature of that will change over time, and I think that's been reflected. One of the things we're seeing that's quite interesting in the UK now is we've had a contracts for difference system that has guaranteed offtake for renewable energy producers and being very successful. But we're increasingly seeing two things now happening. One is, as a result of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the cost of gas has gone up, and the marginal cost of electricity in the UK has gone up considerably. And we're now seeing project developers looking at the market and saying, maybe we should take a mercantile approach and sell on a spot basis. And as you link it up with storage, then that becomes really exciting, and variable tariffs. So one of the other things that can start being introduced is the concept that we're seeing in Europe as we move to more and more renewables is demand management. We're used to it. If you get here on a flight, if we came on EasyJet, if you come to Sharm el Sheikh on EasyJet the day before COP26, COP27, you're going to pay a lot of money. If you come at Wednesday morning at 3 a.m., you're going to pay less money. And we're seeing demand management is increasingly a way in which we can resolve some of these issues in our markets as well. And that can mobilize all sorts of capital.
Thank you, John. Yasira, I'm going to turn to you. As we look to the future, on the assumption that we undertake this journey successfully, the young people of today are going to be providing the intellectual input, going to be providing the actual input into the jobs, both skilled and unskilled, that are required. Do you think the panel is convincing you and the youth of South Africa that we're on a journey that is in fact up to your standard?
That's a question. That's a big question. I think as we move into this deal and this partnership, and we see it come to fruition, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and there's a lot of things that can go right. So at the moment, we have a detailed investment plan, and we have a pathway forward. But like I said, it's dependent on how much we prioritize justice and how much we prioritize the people over the profits that we could make. So for me, this is dependent on how we seize the opportunity and how we use economic policies to enhance the future of South Africa. So when we talk about investment, when we talk about climate financing, we as young people do not want to inherit a country that is ridden with debt. And that is one of the things that ensures that young people have a good future, because debt inhibits us in ensuring other public entities like public health care or public education. We also don't want to see a future where the job market is worsened, where we weren't intentional enough, where we weren't careful enough, and things are worse off than they are now. And we don't want to see the green economy producing the same inequalities and the human rights violations as the current system does, in terms of casualization or outsourcing and the lack of decent work. So as long as these priorities of human rights and decent work are centered, I think we are on a pathway towards something good.
Thank you for that, Yaseera. Simon, you talked about the role that philanthropy can play in enabling and building capability in the institutions that already exist. Do you see a role for philanthropy in the financing stack that makes up the kind of blended finance instruments that would be absolutely necessary to be made fit for purpose for various programs? And do you think that philanthropy, in essence, profit reinvested from either rich individuals or from large companies, actually finding expression to that reinvestment in a scaled up way for undertaking not only transitions successfully, but ensuring that those transitions are assisted either over the risk hurdles or get to a place where they become self-fulfilling and self-propelling?
Thank you. The answer to your specific question is possibly, in terms of being in the sort of the capital stack. But we are looking at that in South Africa and actually also in Indonesia. And once the task team is ready to engage with philanthropy in detail on where specifically can we map philanthropy against the investment plan, we are very, very keen to get into that level of detailed assessment. And as I said, we're doing the same in Indonesia right now. However, I think it's an error if we look at philanthropy capital in the same, only in the same context as the development finance capital and the private sector capital. Those pots of capital are massively bigger than right now we have available to philanthropy, and they also have less flexibility than philanthropy. So we feel the optimal way to use philanthropy is in several areas. Number one is to, as I said earlier, to continue to help to capacitate government with what it needs to do to drive this forward. And we feel that the energy transition is so complicated across government that we strongly advocate some form of cross-government delivery unit, PMO office, something like that, that can take what is essentially a cross-functional plan and coordinate it across government. And we thoroughly support the thinking in the South African government to create some version of that. Number two is, again, the PCC. I want to so echo what Lebo said about we need an economic diversification plan that works for the communities that are affected, the people and the ripple effect into communities and the supply chain and SMEs, that preferably remains in that location. That must be first prize. And we are supporting all efforts of the PCC and others to develop those economic plans with the province, with the sub-provincial level. We think there are strong opportunities to rethink a clean energy economy where, including with distributed renewables, not always grid renewables, they actually create more jobs and more economic effect than fossil fuel on grid. There is an emerging body of evidence showing that. So we strongly encourage philanthropic capital to support the analysis and the planning to show how a clean energy economy anchored in Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and elsewhere can deliver not just replacement, but actually growth in the economy and in jobs. And then I think the third area is to the point of the capital stack. Yes, possibly, but I can't get this into 4 C's, but it has to be catalytic and additional. We do not think it's a smart use of philanthropy to be subsidizing the development finance world. We think they should be taking more risk, not less risk. And we also are ultimately a charitable purpose. We cannot be subsidizing the private sector. We can be unlocking all of those. So the devil, as always, is in the detail. And we just echo, let's get on with it, let's implement, let's learn as we do, and let's not delay.
Thank you for that, Simon. Very elegant. We've got 2 questions online, and Daniel, I'm going to pose them to you because one of them is for you specifically. If I can find them now. What are the next steps in consulting around the JET IP? And in this particular case, it's a question from a youth member online. And secondly, which I'm also going to pose to you, is a question that says, how do we ensure that as we undertake the shift from energy insecurity to energy security, that we ensure that we do this in tandem?
Thank you very much for those questions. Just allow me, before I get to the specific question, just to pick up on some of the points that were made and to actually echo them and just emphasize them with regard to the financing. Some of the points that Nazmira made that John picked up on, because that's when we start sort of putting the, the finger on the wound, and you touched on some of this. It's going to be very, very critical that we have very sober discussions about financing. As South Africa stated right up front, we said that we can only succeed in reaching our decarbonization targets and alongside re-engineering our growth and development model, as we said, if the financial resources are available. And some of the points that were touched on, I think, need us to really talk Turkey around risk sharing, around how we think about risk return profiles, investment horizons. And as we're talking, the analogy of some of the issues we saw post the great financial crisis sort of came to mind, where we're all saying, we want a safer financial sector, we want the banks to be better capitalized, we want them to be less levered, and all of those kind of things. But at the same time, we didn't moderate the return expectations. We want the same return expectations that came from the days of casino banking to accompany this. And I think the issue around economic diversification that was mentioned is sitting, at least conceptually, in the plan. And that's the key issue, is going to be how we translate that. And finally, to the point there, one of the key financing principles that we define right at the outset to say what is going to guide our approach to engaging our partners with regard to finance included taking into account our fiscal realities and making sure that we don't unduly burden future generations with climate-related debt. So, and as part of what we were doing, we're working very closely with the National Treasury to make sure that our fiscal frameworks and how we look at any debt-related terms take account of that. But just quickly coming back to the 2 questions that you raised, in terms of the consultation process, as many of you are aware, the investment plan was adopted by Cabinet. And as part of developing that plan, there had been initial rounds of consultation, and some of the elements in the plan have had the benefit of input from those consultations. But given that we are looking here at a multi-decade journey, a very long process of transition, the investment plan by its very nature needs to be a living document that evolves as the situation unfolds. So what will happen now is that while the work progresses, there will be a consultation with the broader public, which will primarily help inform the critical stage that we talked about earlier. That's the next one around implementation. So that's going to be the how and how that actually registered on the ground, how impactful it is with the communities, with the workers in the specific regions and the sectors is what will help us with the next round that we are. But I do want to allay any fears that that potentially might lead to stalling of processes. So the process continues and while we obtaining the benefit of that input. Now you need to remind me of the second question.
Thank you. Yes.
What was it?
The second one, how do we ensure energy security
Oh, yes.
as we undertake the journey towards energy for the economy and growth?
Very quickly, that is certainly part of the consideration that as and when we transition, this happened in a very responsible, in a phased manner that takes into account how quickly the investments in the transmission grid, how quickly you can ramp up renewables, and most of the way in which the plan is designed as to how we get to achieve the decarbonization commitments in most instances relates to levels of utilization of the current fleet in terms of how one runs that down, and that needs to work together with security energy availability. So that's very much front and center to make sure that we don't cause problems while trying to fix others.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I'm going to, with a few minutes left, going to turn to the audience and ask for, if possible, very succinct questions to either the panel in general or to specific members of the panel. Yes.
Thanks, Deepak, to the panel. It's Brandon Adminal from the Center for Environmental Rights. If green hydrogen is a big part of this plan, might we see a situation where a company like Sasol, our second largest greenhouse gas emitter, a company with a huge market cap, receives climate finance? And if so, how does that tie in with the imperatives of distributive justice? Thanks.
I'm going to take one more question there at the back.
Good morning, Nicholas from HDF. I would be curious to know, so now that the plan is being refined, what we could expect as first materialization of the plan on the ground in the core regions of South Africa.
One more question, and then I'll hand over to the panel to field them.
Good morning. My name is Dora from the South African Local Government Association. I just want to welcome this investment plan, and because I see that it's going to assist municipalities to de-link and to decouple their local economies from coal-based economies. I just want to be able to understand how will this investment or this funding be able to assist many municipalities that already struggle with dilapidated infrastructure, to be able to not only provide the funding, but also provide the technical assistance and the means to be able to fetch the projects or the various interventions from municipalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. The first question was, will the likes of a Sasol, which is amongst the world's highest single point emitter, be a recipient of climate finance? Who wants to take that question? Nazmira, yes. Daniel, do you?
No, I think it's part of the discussion that we started earlier, which talks about obviously appropriate and risk-sharing arrangements, where we need to be clear that risks are allocated to those that are best able kind of to manage them. Whereas, of course, a company like Sasol and the great potential that Green Hydrogen Harbor sits with some of the IP and the technology around Fischer-Tropsch and what they have, there could be elements of which might be required with regard to feasibility studies, proof of concepts and all that, but one would have to be very disciplined to make sure that you don't get public sector money going to places where actually private sector money can go, where the risks are clearly understood. And so we have to be very vigilant that if there are any elements of this finance that would go there, that would be exactly speaking to the catalytic nature of what it is that potentially might be required to get certain processes going. But it's certainly not going to be a situation. The same thing applies to electric vehicles, where you know, that might not be the best use of concessionary finance when people are able to take those risks and commercial risks that are well understood. So we have to be very disciplined. If there is support, it's got to be highly targeted and be justifiable.
So if we think about Sasol more broadly, this is a company which, as you say, accounts for going on 15% of South Africa's emissions, largest point emitter of carbon in the world. But it also employs 80,000 people. The output from Sasol is critical to many other industries in South Africa. So if this company actually has a viable plan, Daniel's point, has to be viable, has to be possible, to use its Fischer-Tropsch technology to go from something highly carbon intensive to something that is green in nature, can be catalytic as for other industries in South Africa in the same way that Fischer-Tropsch was originally. I think that's something we have to explore. On a private sector financing basis, we are actively working with Sasol around their decarbonization plan. And Fischer-Tropsch making green hydrogen is, you know, a long way away right now. But if that becomes viable, it has to be something we look at.
Thank you. And I'm going to take the liberty of answering the question that you raised. Side by side with this, the World Bank announced that it was going to be providing, independently of the 8.5 billion, the early money that is required for the decommissioning and repurposing of Komati. Part of this plan is the Accelerated Coal Transition Investment Plan, funded with a concessional component, leveraging thereafter private sector capital for further decommissioning and repurposing, repowering of Eskom power stations. So I suppose what that means is that these are going to be the early stages of already begun to be implemented programs that are consistent with the JET IP. I'm very, very mindful of time, and maybe we'll take two more questions.
Just one on this side about the
one question.
Sorry, there was a question that hasn't been answered. A question that has not been answered around the municipal. Yeah, just very quickly. Absolutely. Alongside the three priority areas of electricity, new energy vehicles and green hydrogen, we have identified in the plan cross-cutting areas that have got to do with skills developments and including, for instance, as a particular feature that we've highlighted, they're supporting municipalities and the sub-national government level, given exactly how important it would be in the implementation of the plan. So local authorities, municipalities, very, very key to the implementation, and making sure that appropriate capacity building mechanisms accompany the transition, and sort of new models that need to be developed there to strengthen local government to be able to play its role.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Literally last question.
Okay, hello, this is Lamise Umarji. I'm from News 24. So this question is for Daniel and John. In terms of the comment on the money flows, I just wanted clarity on whether there are any material conditionalities to it, like would we not be allowed to build new coal projects, as an example, if in order to access the funds?
Let me quickly start and John can add. Look, when it comes to money, when it comes to borrowing, TNCs apply always. But I think we just need to be clear that, well, obviously there would be some arrangements that we need to agree upon, as indeed was in the political declaration that I talked about earlier, with regard to our partners needing to be comfortable with an investment framework into which they would mobilize funds. But that it's important not to confuse that with conditionality that will lead to South Africa no longer being in control of its own policies. What was very critical in the process and where we're on the same page is that policy sovereignty and policy flexibility rests with the South African government.
John, are you happy with that answer?
I'm very happy, as always, with everything Daniel says. We generally find ourselves of one mind. So as he said, that the JETP is country-led. And sometimes we put new money in from the UK and people say, what's that new money going to be spent on? And I say, well, I don't know. We're waiting for the investment plan for South Africa to tell us where it needs to go. But equally, the Just Energy Transition Partnership is a partnership for energy transition. And the goal of the partnership is to help South Africa achieve the most ambitious end of its NDC, 350 megatons CO2 equivalent a year. And that's the purpose of the partnership. And we've been very clear as a consequence of that, that this is a partnership in which our money will not be used for fossil fuels. We know that fossil fuels will continue to be a part of the energy mix in South Africa, but our money is to support the transition to a clean, low carbon economy, which will create faster growth and greater jobs.
And be fundamentally wrapped in the just transition. We really have run out of time. This is a multi-booked venue. I'm going to call on Dr. Crispian Olver now, our Executive Director at the PCC. Literally, Crispian, with 4 minutes to round up, wrap up, and say the last word.
Hello. Okay. Well, morning, everyone. Fascinating discussion. Well done to our panel and to Deepak. I just want to say 3 points before we close. First of all, let's not underestimate the importance of this moment. We've been through quite a journey to get here, through the Just Transition Framework, the JET IP, the various efforts that Daniel and his team have been leading and that the IPG group has been leading. So, in many ways, this is a deeply collective effort that has delivered the product that we have in front of us for consultation. Secondly, as Amar said earlier, what we're doing at this point is bringing the climate and the development agenda together. And for a long time, they've worked in separate and parallel streams. And it's become fundamentally clear to us as we move forward that we can't talk about the deep systemic change that we're trying to do to the economy without thinking at the same time about the economic and the social consequences and the opportunities that this transition gives us to redress some of our deeply historical inequities and poverty and unemployment in the South African economy. Thirdly, I think what we heard very clearly today is, finance is important. And, there's, the grants, the concessional, the blended, the development finance, the stack, as Deepak said, that's all got to play its role. But that's not the only part of the equation. We've also got to do. So we've got to, plan, fund, do, and we need to do in a way that is inclusive and builds this multi-stakeholder approach that we're trying to trigger. And, I was very taken with Simon's comments around getting a sort of cross-functional delivery capacity set up in government to get this plan underway. And I don't need to tell you where we've come from. I mean, we've had a a decade of state capture and corruption and the hollowing out of the state. So the attention to capacity and the attention to governance and getting these funds spent correctly and in the right places is fundamentally important, and we don't underestimate it. So I think a very important set of points that came out of this morning. 2 days ago, the president stood up at this conference and said, we want to see a just energy transition financing mechanism, not just for South Africa, but that brings this broad range of developing countries into the equation. Many of them are looking at similar processes. And I'm struck by the 4 C's, you know, John and Dipak's 4 C's. And I think we're starting the lexicon of what that kind of financing mechanism looks like and how replicable it can be in other contexts. So thank you for coming today. It's great to have you all with us, and we look forward to the rest of the conversations.
Thank you.